This project requires that you paint a canvas black. You can use a black gesso, but I prefer to use paint because it has a better finish than gesso. The black background on this canvas is black oxide or Mars black, which is what I've used. I like the semi-gloss finish, and I like the fact it doesn't reflect as much. This top one is a phthalo blue and burnt sienna and red mix. This is an ultramarine blue and burnt sienna mix. This is a matte medium, so it's really dulled and grayed, the finish. This is a gloss medium over top of the black oxide, and this is a carbon black. Carbon black is shinier. I'm going to just tip that a bit, so hopefully we're picking up some of the gloss differences. And so a mixed black is just as good. I just find the pre-mix back for a background to be very convenient. So we're going to do an easy one here today that's going to get you to practice color mixing and laying down opaque solid color. I'm going to be using chalk, 2 different sizes riggers, a 6 and a 2, and a small filbert with rather longish hairs. The colors we're using is a yellow deep, a warm yellow or a yellow light, a warm red, and this can be a pyro red, naphthol red, a cadmium red, whatever you have, as long as it's warm, meaning it's leaning more towards the orange side than the cool magenta side. This is ultramarine blue, and this is titanium white. So we're going to start off with just a chalk drawing. Chalk is an ideal thing to draw with on acrylic because the chalk will just wipe off easily. You don't have to worry about leaving pencil marks, and the chalk has no pigment, so it's not going to affect your colors like, say, a piece of charcoal would, is almost pure pigment. So when we're doing this drawing, the chalk, we're going to be painting between the chalk. So we had a hard patch in that chalk. So we're going to create a nice rhythm. So when you're doing rhythm, you have things that you can vary. We can vary the thickness of the tree. I'm putting a thick one in there. You can vary the angle, like that one's veering off a little bit, and we can vary the spacing. So I'm doing a thin one just down the side that actually runs into that one. And so we're just trying to create something that's relatively pleasing, slightly back angle there. And I'm going to leave a bit bigger gap there. We'll do a couple of thinner ones together. And one of the things you notice, I'm left-handed and I'm drawing from the right-hand side. And the advantage of doing that is I'm not dragging my hand through the chalk. I'll do I think a thicker one there. So we're trying to give a natural sense of, we don't want to do anything too weird like a little kink in the tree. We want to keep it fairly regular. And I think we're going to leave that rather large space on the end there. So now I'm just going to throw in some branches. Try not to do anything too repetitive like I just did there. And you're going to be painting between these chalk lines. The chalk does not act as a resist. It is merely a reminder saying don't paint there. And so don't fill the whole thing with chalk or you're not going to have any space to paint. I'm going to put most of the branches are towards the top. And you'll notice that they're all angled up, and that's fairly typical in a bush, and especially if it's an ash tree. Ash trees tend to have an upward angle, so we can change some of those angles a bit, throw a few more in there. One of the things I tend not to do is terminate a branch within the canvas. I take them all off the edges or into another trunk here. So we got one that's sort of terminating there. we can stretch some of these out a bit. It just makes it easier to resolve in the actual painting. I think we might throw, just after I said that, I think we might throw a young, we'll take that off, throw that in there. Okay, so now we're going to start mixing the, well, no, we're going to put this is sort of like a horizon, but it's really the top of the hill or the tree line there. And I think we're going to throw, I'm going to put a circle there, which is going to is going to represent the sun as where the lightest spot's going to be. So we're going to have a lot of this orange glow going out into desaturated purples and desaturated oranges, but the oranges are the weakest color and they're easily contaminated with the blue. So we're going to start with the oranges. We're going to, the red is substantially stronger than the yellow. So where that's not very much red in there. So we're going to start, I think we're going to actually come in with a little bit of white into that. This is just water in those side containers. I like having the water down the side there because it always gives me a clean spot. If I'll keep using the same one. Once it gets dirty, I'll move to a clean one. It saves emptying out a jar. So I'm putting the brush down and I'm just daubing it. So the one thing that I'm going on black here, and so the black is very hard for yellows to cover, but the fact that I have yellow, or sorry, titanium white in there, it's going to make it a lot easier for it to cover. So I'm putting these dabs, I'm trying to create, the same way I was trying to create rhythm in the trees, I am trying to create different marks or rhythm in the brush strokes. So you want to make sure, those of you that might have a Scottish ancestry like me, you want to make sure that you're using enough paint so you get clean edges. We don't want raggedy edges here. We want it pretty clean. So we've sort of lost where that ball is, but that's not going to be a huge problem. We're not after a ball for the sun. We just needed a general location. So I'm going to come back into the more orange color here. And so I'm going to start radiating that out. And you want this paint, so I keep adding water to it so that it stays in a little bit more of a liquid state. So it flows off that brush. And you can see some of the, now there's less titanium white in here. It's not covering quite as well. It's not something we're going to worry about at this point because we're going to be coming back and hitting all these spots again with a second color. Generally, we're going to work from the light out to the dark, and then we're going to come back into the center again and then work lighter out into the dark again. So I'm going to make that a little bit more red-orange now. And so we're just going to daub that there all around the rim. Going to take all that, I'm just going to mix up a little bit more water or paint there. And one of the things is it's a lot easier to paint if you actually have some paint down on the canvas. So I'm just adding more water to get that in a nice fluid state. Riggers are not the ideal mixing brush, but sometimes it's a pain to keep shifting brushes. I never use a knife to mix with. I only use a knife if I'm going to be painting with a knife, or if I'm doing a very large painting and I have to actually mix up quite a lot of paint. We're just going to bring a little bit of this red down into the horizon. And we're just going to drop a little bit of strays just outside the general area there, or the radiance. We're going to start coming into the more desaturated red oranges. We don't want too big of a step between the colors. We want to get the idea of that sunshine glowing out into the night sky or evening sky. And like I say, do not worry. This is covering quite a bit better than that second orange we mixed up, mostly because of the red and the ultramarine blue in this mix. Now, if you don't have a steady hand, you can put your little baby finger down to rest. That's very handy if you're having tea with a queen as well. I haven't been invited just yet. Well, I guess not the queen anymore. So we're going to shift that more into the blue, but we're going to keep adding white to that because the blue makes it much darker than we want it to be. So this is getting into what some might call mud, but it really is just a beautiful desaturated red. And it's a real shame not to include desaturated colors in your painting because they really are beautiful. And it makes the colors much more interesting rather than, say, just straight primary and secondary colors. And this is quite an abstract painting, so we're not too concerned about getting everything bang on right. But one of the things you want to do is don't be too far from the line. You want to go snug right up to that line. When we're done, we're going to be taking that chalk off. And if you haven't gone close enough to the line, you're not going to have those tree patterns as clear. This is a lead-in to negative painting, which you can see. I'll have another video just on negative painting. So with this is the number 6 rigger I'm using, so you can come right up on the point and just get a little dab in there. And when we want to get some of the smaller ones, we'll use the number 2. But I can also push down and drag that and get quite a longer one. And if you really push down, you can get quite a large one with the same brush. So it is very flexible that way. Now we're going to start moving that into a blue. Now you can make some lovely purples using the warm red, but they pretty much have to be a blue purple. There's too much yellow bias in a warm red to give yourself some really saturated red purples, but you get some might think that's gray, but again, it's a very desaturated purple. Oops, we went over that branch a bit. We'll just come out there. And the advantage, I don't buy any secondary colors like greens, oranges, or red. The advantage of mixing your own is you get greater variety and generally much more interesting painting. And it's easier to practice your color mixing when you don't have 27 different colors and you have to try and remember, well, how did I mix that color? Some smaller stuff, I'm just going to lay that brush down there and come up with the number 2 and just get some of these smaller areas. I really want to fill most of the larger spaces in. The object here, though, is not to fill all, you want the black around each of these individual colors. It doesn't matter if you lose a little bit, but what the black is doing for us, even though these are very desaturated colors, it can give this, the black gives these colors almost a jewel-like quality, because the black is completely dead, lacking in any color. And so when you put even a little bit of color, it can really make a big difference to the way those colors are perceived. Colors are very much perceived by what's around them. You put a red right next to a cobalt teal, say, and that red will just pop, because those are the visual complements. So I think it's about time for a color switch. We'll lay that down. So now we're going to come into something quite a bit bluer. And it is nice to have those smaller shifts. Anytime I'm working with a dark color like the ultramarine, I'm always adding the white to get that. I'm going to now start a new color over here, and this is going to be back into the more purple side of the color. Not quite that dark, but we want to see definitely a darker, so I want to create a redder version of that. I like that. So on the palette, that looks kind of brownish, but you can see against that black, it really shows off nicely. And we're going darker down here to give the sense of the evening shadows coming into the ground below the sky. I'm using a Stay Wet palette here, which is a piece of water transferable paper where there's a wet sponge underneath, and that water keeps coming through the paper to keep my paints wet. It's very useful so that you don't have to keep mixing up more of a given color. Those colors, these colors could be good the next day or for several days, depending on where you're painting. But I used to paint just on glass. The surrounds of this table that I'm working on, it is a glass palette that I'm working on, and I still do resort to using that glass, but most of the time I am using this Stay Wet palette. Masterson's is I believe Winsor Newton does have one, but I can't say I was overly impressed the one time I saw it. The paper's not as good. Now the sponges that come with the Masterson's Stay Wet palette work very well, but I've found that they don't last long. They tend to get mildewy and rot, and so what's underneath mine now is a product that they use it's vegetable. You put it in your vegetable drawer to keep the vegetables off the hard plastic, and I find that foam very good for having lasting. It's maybe not quite as good as the Masterson's foam, but it sure lasts a lot longer and it doesn't smell as much. I mean, if you're constantly changing your paper, it's really not a problem as far as the odor goes, but the sponge still does break down. I don't know why they don't make a more resilient sponge for these to go with them. Probably because they make a lot of money selling the sponges. If you're getting a sponge to replace these, I got them from Amazon. Not that I want to advertise for Amazon, but you just have to make sure it is a reticulated foam, not a non-reticulated. Reticulated means that the cell's walls of the foam are open, so it can absorb water as opposed to repel it. Most sponges are reticulated, but not all. So we've pretty much done our first layer. So now we're going to come back and gradually move the color out. So, and it doesn't really matter if, like the first time I worked from the inside out, we're not going to be as concerned about that. I think I'm just going to clean that brush. So, and I'm going to mix up more of this yellow orange. So when we're going to start layering this color down, I'm going to put this color on top of the color or the next color that's a little bit darker. In this case it's the red, but you see what I'm doing is I'm not covering all the red. The idea is to get these glowing cells by layering the color on top of it, and so I don't have to put it right on top or like right in the center. I can have it off center, and so in some cases here I'm filling in the cell a little bit more. But keep in mind, I still have there's black around most of the elements here. So we don't want to cover all those colors, or sorry, the black around each of the elements. My brain drifts a little bit when I'm painting. As that black around it is what's really giving those colors a punch. And so, and some of the spots, the larger spots, I'm putting 2 dabs in there, and others I'm just doing the 1 dab. So I'm hitting most of that red color, or the lighter of the red color. So we'll just put the odd one out there. So I think what I'm going to do, yes, I'll come into the deeper red now, or deeper, and so this has a little bit of white in it, which is keeping the orange a little bit lighter. You do want to wait for these colors to dry. It's not essential, but it sure does make things a lot easier because you're not mixing with the underlying color. It's still a little bit wet lower down what I've just done, but I think we'll go a little redder still as we get into these. And the more steps you do with the color, the better looking this is going to be. And so I'm hitting both that sort of desaturated color and the darker red, or the less desaturated red. And if you do make what you consider to be a major mistake, you can always let it dry and just repaint in some of the black. In this particular case, I have used black oxide. Black oxide is the same as Mars black. And what I like about black oxide over, say, a carbon black is it's not glossy. And so it has a nice matte finish. And you'll find brand to brand that matte finish is not always the same. I particularly like the Amsterdam black oxide. It's generally considered a student grade paint, but it has a beautiful matte finish. Most of the time I use Tri-Art paints, which are Canadian, for that reason. But if you learn your pigments, you'll realize that the difference between a student grade and a professional grade paint is the quality of the pigment. In the case of iron oxide, it makes no difference if you're using a student grade. Sometimes the pigment is lower in a student grade, but and you won't get the expensive pigments in the student grades. But in the case of iron oxide, there is no quality drop there. It's iron, it's cheap, it's dead cheap, so there's no real advantage to shorting the amount of pigment in there. So I think I'm just going to come into here and just red this color up a little bit. So now we're just going to radiate that out. So it looks pretty damn dull right there on the palette, but when I lay it on top of that more purple color, it's a gorgeous color. I've always liked changing the color of things. It's just, as a child, I would get into the house paints in the basement and just start coloring things. It's a certain amount of joy in changing the color of something. Let's just see what that color. It's kind of gray. I think I'll start. I'm going to take some of that blue off the side here. We're going to make something much bluer. So this is just ultramarine blue and white pretty much. I haven't cleaned the brush exceptionally well, so there is a little bit of contamination from the other colors, but not much. Again, when you're doing this, make sure that you are leaving some of the underlying color. There's no point in doing layers of color if you're going to cover all the underlying layer. And it's this that helps give it the glow or jewel-like quality to this. When you see this finished, it's quite a nice little technique. I'm just going to put a little bit of that . to switch our brushes again. Using the number 2 rigger. I actually haven't used the filbert brush in this. The number 6 rigger is such a capable brush that you can get such broad marks with it, and it holds so much paint, so you often don't need to go to the larger filbert. In a larger painting I might do that, but this is pretty small. You'll notice that I go back to the palette frequently to get more paint. Don't push the brush beyond the paint that's on it. One of the things I like about this as a practice painting is it teaches you how to get the viscosity of the paint right, so that it's flowing off the brush nicely, but not so thick that it won't leave nice smooth marks, and also not so thin that you have to hit it 12 times before it actually covers. So we're just going to make I think we'll try this color in here. So this is a little bit of a grayer red, and I'm just going to use that on these dabs here. Now there's nothing to say that you don't hit some of these colors 3 times with 3 different colors. You pretty much have to restrict it to the larger ones, or you're just going to be covering up the colors there. So we need a color. I think I'd like to get a little of this over here. So this is not quite 3, because I'm not putting them on top of each other, but I'm putting them intermixing a bit. And it sort of gives a blend of the colors, somewhat like the way it does in color printing, that you get all the colors in color printing, but they're side by side. So they're actually blending in the eye, and they're very small, so you can't really see that. But let's just come in and make a color to finish off the bottom there. Let's see. So you can say, well, that looks good, but it's probably a little too dark because the acrylics are going to dry darker. So I'm just going to throw a little bit more white in. This is probably going to look too light, but I think it should dry just at the right level. I mean, the more you paint, the more you're going to get used to how much that color is going to shift. I think acrylics are much superior to oil paints, but in this respect, oil paints are definitely nice because oil paints do not have that value shift when they dry. Now we're going to clean those brushes well, because we're going to come back and get that sun in there. So we're going to be working in the near white colors. It's just adding white to our light orange. So now we're going to I think we're going to blow out all those black lines just there, because this is where the actual sun is. And so we want, and quite often I think will even go through that tree. And quite often when you see pictures that you've taken of a sun in behind trees, you will see that the light has wrapped around that tree trunk, making it look like the top is floating. And that's just anytime you have a very intense backlight situation, it will wrap around the object. It doesn't happen on the moon or in where there is no atmosphere because there's no light to scatter, just in case you're painting on the moon ever. So you can see these oranges that weren't covering that well really wasn't that much of a problem because we're putting on this much lighter color, hiding most of the central part of that. I'm going to get a little bit more paint there. Going a little bit darker or more orange as I move out. So some of these now are getting their third hit. It's one of the things I've always liked about acrylic is how quickly they do dry. And I'm going to change the size of some of these. It's starting to look a little bit speckled, so I want less of that. So I'm just going to clean that brush, and I'm going to come into this red orange, and I'm actually going to paint. And that's the nice thing about this chalk is the chalk does not interfere. So we're just painting, and this is the same thing as the light burning through the trunk, but the light is not directly behind, so it's just burning through a portion, or the colors are not as intense as they might be right in front of the sun. Okay, so we're going to let that dry, and then we're going to put some pure white on that, where the center of the sun is. And then we're going to let the whole thing dry very thoroughly, and we're going to take the chalk, and actually, I'm not a very patient individual, so we'll just come in with that pure white. So I'm putting that on pretty thick. So now it's time for the big reveal, and I'm using a blue paper towel, or the shop towels rather than the white paper towels, because they tend not to ball. And so I've just wet that, and I just wipe that off, and we reveal the black paint underneath. This is dried for an hour or two, and so the paint is quite dry. Don't rush this so that you don't end up smearing the paint. Looks like I have a little bit of white. I'm refolding the paper towel because although you may not see it, there's chalk residue on that. And I prefer not to spray the canvas because this paint really isn't dry yet. There's still the glycol component of the paint in there, and so it can delaminate if it gets overly wet. And so that looks like it's all off, but we're just refolding, and we're just going to give that another white because when that dries, there's often some chalk residue left there. And so there we have a nice, easy painting for you to try.